suppose I could have titled this video, Why I Am Not a Transhumanist, or Why I Am No Longer a Transhumanist, but that would have been a misleading title. For one, I've never been a quote-unquote hardcore transhumanist. I've never used the capital T version to describe myself. I've never actively participated in discussions or debates, and I never had a lot of social intercourse with people who may or may not have shared ideas and a sense of what transhumanism is and what it could do for humanity. So in a very real sense, I never was an official transhumanist, but many people have, throughout the past year or two, posed the question why I seem to be drifting away from a transhumanist stance. And to be fair, I've always been sympathetic and inclined towards that to some degree. And so this video is meant to be an explanation as to why I no longer think too much about transhumanism per se, and am skeptical of any actual progress we can make long term for the species and, of course, for all of humanity, our future as a civilization. The first question I ask is, what is transhumanism? I'm not even sure what it is. On the matter or question of whether or not we are going to make more progress and change human nature, I think that's a likely inevitability. But just because we're going to change things about ourselves and our environment and how we interact with it doesn't mean that necessarily needs to take the stamp or the label of transhumanism. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. I do think change is coming, and we're going to change ourselves in perhaps very fundamental ways, but that doesn't mean that's transhumanist per se, and there are several reasons for that. I suppose I should begin by explaining my skeptical position on moving forward as a species. And there are two issues that are at the core of the skepticism. The first issue is the necessary compatibility human beings have to have with any attendant changes they may or may not introduce into their lives and consequently into society. And what do I mean by that? Well, things that fundamentally shift or change human nature need to gel and concord with that human nature. Inasmuch as they don't, it's very unlikely that those types of changes are ever going to get off the ground. So we can think of this first perhaps in terms of political policy. There's much talk about dysgenics and eugenics and reproduction and overpopulation, underpopulation. But in the midst of this, there's always that presupposition that it is a fundamental human right that all people can, should, ought to reproduce, because people just think that. But why do they think that? It's because it's something deeply embedded, deeply ingrained in our nature. Reproduction is the name of the game beyond mere survival, quote unquote, supposed to pass on your genes and all that jazz. However, and this isn't transhumanist per se, it's obvious that some people have a more beneficial genome in terms of the species than other people. And thus you could propose, not unreasonably, that some people should reproduce or reproduce more than other people. A person whose genome denotes poor health, low intelligence, all these things, it probably is not the greatest propagator of DNA in an overarching sense, not beyond the sense of merely passing on your genes. There is no rhyme or reason beyond that in nature. But I would suspect that the vast majority of people would just view this as anathema, proposing that only certain people should reproduce based on the qualities of their genome. Why would a policy like that not really take hold of the vast majority of people? Because it just runs against the commonly perceived notion that everyone has a fundamental right to reproduce. And of course, this all stems from our deep-seated desire to propagate our genes, and that this is a quote-unquote fundamental right. And that's not a transhumanist thing per se, but it does move into the territory of bettering ourselves through differentiated policy. But here's something that would be more transhumanist. A pill that would simply take care of all of your nutritional needs. To be honest, I don't think such a pill could be created, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, there were a pill you could take in the morning that would take care of your caloric needs, your micronutrient needs, all these other things, antioxidant, etc., but it wouldn't really give you that fundamental sense of satisfaction you get when you're consuming a proper meal. This food pill, as we'll call it, would also lead to dramatic, theoretically speaking, of course, dramatic drops in obesity and health issues. Do I actually think that this pill would take hold in the majority of people on the planet? Well, no, because palatability is a very important factor in consumption of food. To merely swallow a pill that takes care of your traditional needs, as healthy as that might be, as great as the outcomes might be regarding nutritional deficiencies and problems with nutrition such as obesity, malnourishment in the third world, etc., I don't think people would go for it. And that's because it just wouldn't jive or gel with fundamental human nature. The fact that we have taste buds and people feel they need to consume foods that are largely palatable to them. So whatever changes are introduced that change human nature, they have to be changes that sync with what we are fundamentally at a very baseline level. That's not to say that no one would go along with this, but changes are always driven by a majority. They're not driven by lone individuals. Would I be someone who would sign on to that pill? Absolutely. At least I think I would. But the food pill would not be popular with most people. For example, Esteem Coltane has routinely said that he would reject such a hypothetical pill. I don't think such a pill could be put on the market because I just don't think you could put everything into such a pill. But still, he would reject it because he likes eating his roast chicken and cooking and what have you. He likes enjoying things. I care a lot less about enjoyment and more about the utility of something. But most people would fall into the Coltane category. So whatever else you might envision or think of in terms of technology, innovation, just plain changes introduced, they have to be compatible with what your basic Homo sapiens desires. And that tends to be a very small set of desires and limitations, and everything that's introduced needs to fall within that in order to gain popularity. Which leads me to my second point, and also underscores what I've been saying. The human birth control pill, sometimes called just birth control, that piece of hormonal medical technology introduced in the mid-20th century that radically changed everything. Well, let's look at why it was able to do that. For all the reasons I've cited, people for the longest time have wanted to fuck without worrying about the consequences of having to give birth, specifically women. When the pill was introduced to the market, people lapped it up. Women specifically, they were freed from a quote-unquote terrible burden. And so it's been that birth control in myriad forms has spread throughout the developed world. And there's not a country under the sun, be it west or east, that is mildly developed that does not have access to birth control. That's just the way it is. And this is because the technology, this hormonal medical technology that was introduced to the market, gelled with what human beings want, specifically what women want. And so it would have to be with every piece of technology, whether it alters our appetite, our endocrine system, or our basic neurochemistry, it would have to be fundamentally compatible with our desires. And I think a lot of changes and things that your typical transhumanist would like to introduce would not do that. And a lot of this is just haphazard, which, moving on to the second point, I want to elaborate on. The other thing that concerns me, or makes me cast doubt upon the enterprise of quote-unquote transhumanism, is the fact that we are not omniscient. And that should be a given. It should be pretty obvious. Of course, we as human beings are not omniscient. But there are more pressing issues beyond our mere lack of omniscience, namely that we are far removed from omniscience, which is to say, every time we introduce some piece of groundbreaking technology, whatever its nature, be it primarily social, such as the internet, or something such as the birth control pill, that fundamentally changes and shifts human nature. In this case, it radically changes the endocrine profile of a female. Well, we don't know what the consequences are going to be. Hindsight is always 20/20. We don't know what's going to happen when we introduce or create a new piece of technology, and there are always consequences. So let's look at some of the consequences to birth control. There are, of course, social consequences. That's kind of obvious. With the massive availability of birth control, women felt less inclined towards monogamous relationships. It's just a fact. The rates of gratuitous sex went up. This was embodied very much in the 60s and early 70s, a type of libertinism that probably would not have been possible had the birth control pill not been introduced. And so it's been more or less ever since, which is to say, people are a lot looser with their sexual mores, and this has consequences. This has led to a greater rate of transmission of STDs. It has created problems down the line because, for example, we know that women with multiple partners at an early age prior to marriage are much less likely to have quote-unquote successful marriages, whatever that means, which is to say they're more likely to end in divorce or dissolution, an unintended consequence. But what about the physiology? Well, this has not been known for very long, and it certainly wasn't known to the creators of the pill, and was not known for many decades. But in the mid-2000s, it became prominently known that women who are on the pill have a dramatic shift in the type of men they're attracted to. And specifically, this involves the so-called MHC genes, the major histocompatibility complex genes. And these genes are involved in the immune system, and the ideal unpilled woman will be most interested in a man, usually by way of scent, who has a differentiated immune system, which is to say his MHC, his major histocompatibility complex genes, are going to be more different than similar to hers. What happens when a woman goes on the pill? Well, she tends to be more interested in men with MHC genes that are more similar to hers. And this can lead to a huge skewing of relationships. In fact, it's even been speculated, and anecdotally you can find evidence of this online, that women who've been on the pill for many years and then go off of it after having been in a relationship with a man find him not so attractive. Or they find, for example, that classic statement that he begins to smell like her father and therefore is not very attractive anymore. Many of these marriages anecdotally end in divorce or dissolution. And many of these relationships, just in a general sense, no longer work. And this has everything to do with the meddling nature of birth control, which changes the endocrine system of a female and leads them to make, at least in terms of reproductive choices, quote-unquote poor choices, because differentiated immune systems tend to, at least in the evolutionary sense, offer a more robust immune system in terms of the offspring than immune systems of a similar profile. That's the reason behind that. And it can lead to just very different reproductive relationship choice in terms of women. Did the people who introduced the pill think of that? They couldn't have. There's no way they could have envisioned that that would have such a profound effect. But it's certainly possible, and I think there need to be more studies on this, that this aspect of the pill, this changing of female physiology and endocrinology, might in fact be responsible for a lot of the dysfunction and divorce we see in human beings, and largely initiated by women. Another possible reason for why women are most likely, in 70% of the cases, going to be the initiators of divorce. The question is the pill something transhumanist? And yes, I do think it is. It changes the body. The internet is another example. It changed our social environment completely. It changed the way we interacted. It changed the way we engage with each other. It changed the way people dated. mating rituals, all of these things. And this has had unforeseen, unanticipated consequences. The 80-20 rule that people talk a lot about, a lot of that's been borne out by the internet. Prior to the ability to instantly connect with people online, choices were much more limited. There was not this voluminous boatload of imagery of celebrities and instant clicky interaction with people that really changed the way we perceived the world. This is particularly true of women who tend to go for the top 20% of men vis-a-vis their hypergamy. But also in a much more general sense, the internet can lead to tremendous isolation, different means and modes of interaction, and again, completely unforeseen, but it is a type of technology that has changed the way human beings interact. And anything that will have potentially even greater and more profound impact on human beings, something that directly interfaces with our neurology, with our brains, you can only imagine what the negative side effects and consequences of that might be. So I call this the great stumbling. We stumble forward with the progress that we make as a species, rather haphazardly. Whether or not you want to call some of this progress transhumanist, that's up to you. But any transhumanist endeavor is going to have unintended consequences. And I see this time and again with the wishes and the well-wishing of people. A while back, I discovered this server on Discord that was very invested in life extension technology, beating the Grim Reaper or becoming functionally immortal. For one thing, I don't think it's really possible. I think the best case scenario would be extending our lives by a few decades or increasing the prime of our life by a decade or two. And I've had some discussions on this on my channel. I could go into greater depth in a separate video, but I've talked about this. But what are the unintended consequences? Well, this would automatically create a world of the haves and have-nots, as only the wealthy would likely gain access to this technology, and other people would crave and want it but not have access to it, which could create political tensions, social tensions. And the point I'm making here is that anything remotely transhumanist tends to come with a backlog of costs and unintended consequences that the people who introduce the technology are never aware of, and in many cases cannot be aware of, even if they can take into account, have a calculation, as it were, of what may happen. It's very unlikely that that will be exactly what plays out. And so I think we are condemned and confined to this great stumbling forward, where we take one step forward and sometimes half a step backward. I don't have much hope for the species for the reasons cited. Because of this great stumbling, we tend to stumble forward, we're unaware of the consequences, we don't know how things will affect us, and there may well come a point in time when we introduce technologies that change us so fundamentally, and not necessarily in a good way, both in a good way and a bad way, that we won't be able to survive the consequences of our own innovation. We simply didn't evolve to have the foresight to take into account, for example, to cite again, the MHC genes issue with birth control, or the social effects of internet, or really anything that will be put out on the market. Rest assured, when CRISPR-Cas9 technology becomes a thing, and at least the wealthiest people in society gain access to it, assuming we understand the complex genes involved in the traits that we desire to change, this will have unintended consequences. We will probably not be anytime soon in a position to understand the human genome such that we can alter polygenic traits without worrying about something else going awry. Something probably will go awry, and we're going to have to live with those consequences. Do I think these changes are coming? Do I think these are transhumanist changes? Absolutely. But again, I view all of this with very skeptical eyes, because I do think we're going to progress forward. I do think we're going to do the things that transhumanists talk about. I just don't think it's going to be some glorious future necessarily. And I think because of the unintended consequences, because of the unforeseen that routinely seems to crop up whenever we introduce major changes to human nature, be it social, environmental, or physiological, I don't know if long-term we're going to even survive those changes. Which is to say, something could be introduced that so fundamentally alters what we are that we can't go back. And at that stage, human civilization itself might crumble. Do I know that's going to happen? No. But I've just seen us stumble forward so much. And the fact that people are so profoundly unaware of this, that they just blithely go about their lives, either taking birth control or taking into account these things that really, really alter and shift their behavior. This leads me to even greater skepticism, which is, of course, something I've always had, but the fundamental lack of self-awareness in most human beings. The fact that most human beings deny that we're just meat bags of hormones and neurotransmitters that interact with the environment. And when you change things like that, those changes can be beyond profound. Again, leads me to be very skeptical. Would I like long-term to see a species that got off this mud ball, that were able to explore the solar system and the greater galaxy? Well, absolutely. But I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, and I think we're more likely to be doomed to failure than to success. So, the question is, am I a transhumanist? Well, I still, you could say, loosely have transhumanist aspirations, but they're very much aspirations that are curtailed by my own sense of skepticism and caution moving forward, and the haphazard nature of human progress. Human progress is never linear, and at any given moment, the progress could turn into regress. And at that point, if the regress is too great, we might never get back on the path forward. So there you go. In a nutshell, compatibility with human nature, unforeseen consequences, these things are just huge. And I think ultimately they're going to be the biggest hindrance moving forward, because it might be for us to become a spacefaring transhumanist species that we need to overcome to surpass our nature. And we won't be able to do that if, one, we only are on board with things that are compatible with our less than perfect natures, and two, if we cannot at least anticipate most of the consequences due to the introduction of new technologies. Just not going to happen. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. I hope this video was helpful in explaining my position, and I think more generally a sane, reasonable position on transhumanism. And if my health holds up, I will check you out later. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.